My name's Greg Knapp. This is the Greg Knapp Experience, your 20-minute thrill ride for your commute or your workout. Yes, we have the special Thanksgiving edition here for you. I'm going to talk to you about the real Thanksgiving Day story, how NBC suggests saving money this year for Thanksgiving, and how MSNBC tells you that Thanksgiving is really about white settlers who brought genocide and violence. Isn't that nice? Oh, yeah. It's all coming up. This edition of the Greg Knapp Experience. Let's go. All right, so let's start with NBC. A segment on NBC's Today Show. Kristen Welker said, with inflation on the rise, prices are going up on everything from your Thanksgiving meal to your gifts for the holidays. That would be Christmas. NBC News correspondent Vicki Wen noted that the 6.2% rise in prices in October from a year ago is a 3-decade high, and she called it real money. Is that opposed to the fake money that it normally costs? Right, real money. And the solution to all this, of course, they were ready for. You ready? Perhaps forego the turkey. Bear with me. I know that it's the staple of the Thanksgiving meal. However, some people think turkey's overrated. It tends to be the most expensive thing on the table. Maybe you do an Italian feast instead. No turkey? She's talking about tofu? No, she's talking about like the real turkey. No soy? No, I never. Just real turkey, man. It's overrated. Overrated? The white meat's overrated. I agree. I'm a totally dark meat guy in the turkey, man. I could give everybody else the white meat. Just leave me the dark meat. But we're having turkey at the Knapp house, let me tell you. She goes on. Well, if you tell guests you're dumping the turkey, some guests may just drop off the list. And that's a way to cut costs too. I'm not recommending it. I'm just offering it. So now she wants nobody to come? Yeah, well, it depends on who the guests are, I guess, really. NBC previously had published a piece titled, Turkey Social Media Photos Promote Harmful Obsession with Meat. That was 2019. Urging Americans not to post pictures of the turkey because it would promote violence unnecessarily, including the violent origins of our food. I can't make this stuff up. This is awesome. The violent origins of our food. Have you seen somebody with a hoe in a garden? That's pretty violent. And then they rip up those carrots by the roots. I think a carrot is a root. Same thing, you know what I mean? Violence against vegetables needs to stop. NBC's liberal cable arm, MSNBC, that would be more liberal than the NBC part, took a darker turn on the holiday over the weekend, airing a widely panned segment tying Thanksgiving to genocide that remains on the menu. Here's what they mean by that. MSNBC, it was the Cross Connection on Saturday. The host, Tiffany Cross, she brought on liberal Native American activist Gayasi Ross, a show favorite, with a pre-recorded essay. Ross began by claiming it is a, quote, pathology of white America to see their ancestors as improving North America after they arrived. He then added, but I'm still trying to find out what indigenous people received of value. Well, I mean, the country's pretty good now. No! Instead of bringing stuffing and biscuits, those settlers brought genocide and violence. Well, the Pilgrims didn't. I mean, some other ones definitely brought violence. And, you know, the Indians weren't exactly sitting around singing Kumbaya. You realize that they were fighting each other, tribe against tribe, scalping each other, taking each other's women and children as slaves. Now, I am not for 1 second excusing the bad treatment that the colonists, many of them, did to the Native Americans who were here. No, we did a lot of horrible things to the American Indians. However, the idea that nothing good came from it and that it was all bad on one side and no bad on the other is just not truth. It's just not facts. It's just not history. So Ross goes on in saying this. That genocide and violence is still on the menu, as state-sponsored violence against Native and Black Americans is commonplace, and violent private white supremacy is celebrated and subsidized. Well, as Brad Wilmouth points out, FBI and Washington Post statistics demonstrate, I've talked about this so many times, there's many studies that show Native and African Americans are shot and killed by police officers at a rate that is proportionate to crime patterns, including many more white people being shot and killed by the police, yes, also unarmed, rarely noticed by the media. While that was going on, though, while he was talking about it, they showed on screen a number of victims of police shootings from the racial groups of African American and Native American. They didn't show any of the white people shot and killed. Facts don't fit the narrative, and facts do not work to what they want to do, which unfortunately is divide us by race and focus on race. It's very, very sad, and it really needs to stop. Hey, in just a second, I want to do an homage to Rush Limbaugh, because every year before his passing, he would talk about the real Thanksgiving. And if you've never heard the real Thanksgiving, you need to hang in there for just a second. But if you're enjoying the show and you want to be a part of the movement to help combat the far left's vision of America and version of America and rally around what makes us exceptional, then please listen to the show anywhere you can find a podcast. It's called The Greg Knapp Experience. As you know, you're listening to it now. Tell 3 friends that tell 3 friends. Get like-minded friends together to start sharing this and spreading it so we can push back. So please like my show on Facebook. It's called The Greg Knapp Experience Facebook page. Like that page and tell 3 friends to tell 3 friends to listen to the show. Appreciate you. All right, so I want to do an homage to Rush Limbaugh. I was in talk radio for 21 years. And Rush Limbaugh was the king of talk radio. There's no doubt about it. This guy invented the stuff that most talk show hosts do. I tried very hard after I got into talk radio not to listen to Rush very much because I didn't want to copy him. Because once you hear what he says, you're like, that's awesome. That's pretty smart stuff. And he was funny, and he was irreverent, and he also was very smart and did a great bit of research. And I wanted to do a little celebration of Rush now that he's passed on. Every year he would read the real story of Thanksgiving, and he did a lot of research to pull this up. And some of it, is just straight out from the diary of the governor at the time, William Bradford. So here's some of it. He said, I could probably sum it up at what I learned in Thanksgiving at school over the years by saying the story of Thanksgiving was generally that a bunch of haggard people from Britain arrived at a desolate spot at a very cold time of the year, didn't know what the hell they were doing, and didn't know where they were, and had no idea how to live. And then they met some Indians, some Native Americans, and the Indians saved them. And the Indians showed them how to farm, and they showed them how to make warm coats, and the Indians showed them how to make pumpkins and carve them, and the Indians showed them how to go out and kill turkey. And if it weren't for the Indians, the Pilgrims would have starved, and there never would have been an America, and then the Indians would have never been overrun, and then there wouldn't be any Indian casinos, and on and on, all right? This is Rush. He said, well, there still might have been an Indian casino, but there would not have been an America. Therefore, we owe the Indians everything. And that's essentially the story of Thanksgiving that people are taught. He said, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's how it was taught. Even as I was saying, I was taught a mild version of that, and it's nowhere near the truth. The truth I found in the journals of William Bradford, who was the original governor of the original Plymouth plantation, and one of the primary movers and shakers of putting together the journey on the Mayflower that brought these pilgrims to the New World. And so he wrote about it in his book, See, I Told You So, in chapter 6. So he's sharing this. And here's what it is. The story of the Pilgrims begins in the early part of the 17th century, the late 1600s. The Church of England under King James I was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize its absolute civil and spiritual authority. And those who challenged the ecclesiastical authority of the Church of England and those who believed strongly in freedom of worship were imprisoned, sometimes executed for their heresy. Well, a group of separatists, people who wanted no part of that England, fled to Holland and established a community. And after 11 years in Holland, about 40 of them agreed to make a perilous journey to what was then called the New World, where they would certainly face hardships and experiences that none of them could foresee. But to them it was worth the try, because the objective was to live and worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences, their beliefs, and their desires. So on August 1, 1620, the Mayflower set sail, and it carried 102 passengers, not all of them pilgrims, including 40 pilgrims led by William Bradford. Now on the journey, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract, for all the pilgrims to agree to and sign, and it established just and equal laws for all 40 pilgrims of the new community. And it didn't matter what their religious beliefs were. No, none of that mattered. They just set up a contractual agreement that dictated behavior and a number of other things. Now, the ideas, the Mayflower Compact, by the way, is what it was called. Where did those ideas come from? Where did the revolutionary ideas expressed in the Mayflower Compact come from? Well, the Bible. The Pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Bible, Old and New Testaments. It was the reason they lived. They said to read it, to study it, to practice it. They looked to the ancient Israelites for their example. And because of the biblical precedent set forth in Scripture, now this is all according to Bradford's journal, they never doubted that their experiment would work. They were supremely confident that their objective would occur. But of course, it was no pleasure cruise. It was long, it was arduous. There were the usual bad relationships and problems on board the ship with 102 people, but they did get there, right? They made it in ways that people would not even dream of traveling today. There's only way to get there. It was the only choice, right? So think of how primitive the navigation was and the lack of knowledge of upcoming weather, condition of the seas, yet they did it. Quote, and when the Pilgrims landed in New England in November, they found nothing, a cold, barren, desolate, unsettled wilderness. There were no friends to greet them. There was nobody to greet them. There were no houses. There was no shelter at all other than the trees. There was nothing that could be considered creature comforts at all. No friends, no hotels, no bathrooms, no place they could refresh themselves. And the sacrifice they had made for freedom was just beginning. Now, they arrived at the onset of winter. Half of the first 40 pilgrims, including William Bradford's own wife, died of either starvation, sickness, or exposure. They endured the winter as best they could. When spring finally came, Indians, the Native Americans, did welcome them and taught the settlers how to plant corn, fish for cod, and skin beavers for coats. And life improved for the Pilgrims, but they were nowhere near prosperity. Quote, this is important to understand because this is where modern American history lessons often end. That's from Rush. So we go on. This is what the traditional Thanksgiving story is. The Pilgrims arrived, barely made it through the winter. Indians befriended them and saved them. And we give thanks to the Indians for having saved the Pilgrims. But that's not it. No. Now, this is not to diminish the assistance from the Native American Indians. But that's not what Thanksgiving is about. Thanksgiving is explained in some textbooks as a holiday for which the Pilgrims gave thanks to the Indians for saving their lives, not according to William Bradford. Thanksgiving is a devout expression of gratitude to God for their survival, which, depending on a lot of things after they arrived, a whole lot of things besides just the Indians. So here's the part that's been omitted. The original contract the Pilgrims had entered into, the Mayflower Compact, with their merchant sponsors in London, they had no money. They had to have people help them get there. The original contract called for everything they produced to go into a common store, a common account, and each member of the community was entitled to one common share. In other words, everybody got the same as everyone else. That's the way it was set up. It was fairness. It was equality. All of the land they declared and the houses they built belonged to the community, not to the people personally. They were going to distribute it all equally. All the land they cleared, nobody owned anything. Now, the part I would contest here is that it was fairness and it was equality. I disagree. It's not fairness and equality to have different shares going in and the same shares going out. Now, since the Pilgrims were so much into how the Bible says you should live, maybe they were looking at Acts, the book of Acts, the first church. If you look at it, it said that everybody would bring everything they have and contribute it, and people would take what they needed. However, the part that people forget about Acts and the people that say Jesus was a socialist is the reason the people were doing this in Acts is that they were all believers in Christ, and they just wanted to live together and glorify him. And it wasn't about so much a way to organize a society as just a way to put everything first to God, that God was first above everything else, and that it was all about loving God and loving others in this community that all agreed to that. And I think where the Pilgrims went wrong is they changed that from everybody brought everything that they had and put it in the table to now everything you produce forever is thrown into this table and everybody just takes this an equal share. And if everybody is not all in on Jesus like they were in the book of Acts and really has that in their heart, it ain't going to work. And that's what they found out. They only had a share in it. It was a commune. It was the forerunner to the communes we saw in the 60s and the 70s in California. It was complete with organic vegetables, of course, by the way, right? Because they're the only kind you had back then, which is funny. Bradford had become the new governor of the colony, and he recognized it was not working. It was collectivism. Nobody had any more than anybody else. Nobody had any less. But the problem is that means nobody had more. Everybody had less. Prosperity did not come. It never does with this plan. So after a while, stagnation. Bradford assigned a plot of land to each family to work and manage. And whatever was produced on their farm was theirs. And in an early fashion, this unleashed the power of the marketplace. Long before Karl Marx was even born, the Pilgrims had discovered and experimented with what could only be described as socialism. And it didn't work. You know why it didn't work? When everybody was entitled to the same, some people were slackers. They didn't do their share. They didn't contribute their share. But they got the same amount as everybody else. It led to recriminations, jealousies, anger. Bradford changed it. It's in his journal. What Bradford and his community found was that the most creative and industrious people had no incentive to work any harder than anyone else unless they could utilize the power of personal motivation, keeping most of what you made. But while most of the rest of the world has been experimenting with socialism for well over 100 years, trying to refine it, perfect it, reinvent it, the Pilgrims learned in less than a year it was a failure, and they had to learn quickly or they all would have died. What Bradford wrote about the social experiment should be in every school child's history lesson. And if it were, we might prevent much more needless suffering. He wrote, quote, "The experience that we had in this common course and condition, tried sundry years, that by taking away property and bringing community into a common wealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For this community was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For young men that were most able and fit for labor and service didn't. They waited. They didn't want to produce for other men's wives and children what other men should have been providing, and eventually this was thought injustice. Why should you work for other people when you can't work for yourself? What's the point? The Pilgrims found that people could not be expected to do their best work without incentive. So they tried something else. They unharnessed the power of free enterprise. They invoked the principle of private property. Every family was assigned its own plot of land to work and permitted to market whatever they produced for whatever price they could get, their crops and their products. And guess what happened? Again, back to Bradford, quote, "This had very good success, for it made all hands industrious," which means everybody got off their duffs and started working, of course, right? "Much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been." This is when they first began to get prosperity. And it is for this discovery, by the way, it was at this point that they welcomed the Indians in, because there was so much production after that first barren winter of not having anything that they could bring people in and share it. Trying everybody to get fair treatment didn't work, what they described as fair. When they unleashed the incentives and started simply as you get to keep what you produce, it turned everybody into mass producers. And they had so much more than they needed, they actually had a gratitude winner with the Indians where all the bounty was shared. And the original Thanksgiving was to give thanks to God for the enlightenment and courage and fortitude to withstand all the hardship, to endure all the hassles, all the problems, and finally see it through to prosperity. So they set up trading posts, and they exchanged goods with the Indians. The profits allowed them to pay off their debts to the merchants back in London and Holland who had sponsored the trip. The success and prosperity of the Plymouth settlement attracted more Europeans and began what came to be known as the Great Puritan Migration. It was the word of success and prosperity from the original Pilgrim arrivals that spread to the New World and spawned massive additional trips to the New World. Now, you could reduce it to say it was capitalism versus socialism, and it was, but that would be to undersell and underemphasize what really happened. A people who had undying faith in God survived circumstances they never knew they were going to face and ultimately prospered. And at the end of it all, they were still able to practice their religion as they chose, which was the original reason for their trip in the first place. And for all of that, they were eternally thankful. And that's the real story of Thanksgiving. Thanks for everything you did, Rush. My name's Greg Knapp. This is the Greg Knapp Experience.